Dr. Fox here. We're going to talk a little bit about Chapter 3 Biopsych. I'm going to do this in two parts. This part will talk about some of the nuts and bolts, um, brains, neurons, these kind of things. Um, okay, so um, here we have some scans of brains. So we've got a PET scan, positive emission tomography. So that's going to look at where things are kind of like burning, where energy is being used. This is a CT scan, which gives a really, really high resolution picture of the structures. You might recall that Wilhelm Wundt, with the first psychology lab, was a structuralist. So he would have been so happy to be able to see what the structures are. The only way they knew back in his day was by slicing people open, which you couldn't do it while the person was alive. This allows, like views of living brains. And then this is a fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging. Um, um, so this is the MRI machines, the ones that look like a big donut, and they put the person inside, or a tube, and you put the person inside and it makes a lot of noise. Um, um, really detailed also, but the fMRI allows you to look at stuff over time and see what's happening over some amount of time, depending on how much you can afford. Okay, so we've got a lot of genetic influences, and well, this can be really important. If something is a genetically transmitted disease, that can be really good information to know. If you have identical twins, you're going to learn a lot about that kind of thing from them. Fraternal twins, though, also are a good source because everything is identical up to the point of birth, except for the genetics. So the environmental factors of nutrition, what did the mom do while pregnant? The Maya of, this is going to sound a little off the wall, but the Mayan people of the Yucatan have a certain way that the women weave, generally the women, that requires them to be really still. It's called a body loom. It's like tied to a post and then wrapped around their body. So to maintain tension, you have to be really still. And those babies, possibly from the mom being so still, have certain characteristics that are unlike other people. They have really long attention spans, and they tend to be, pretty settled. Anyway, so there are lots of things that can happen during pregnancy and after. And then what comes out, like these little cute kitties, will be a combination genetically of the two parents. So interesting stuff. Evolution, the main thing I want you to remember here is that it's the most adaptable that survives, not the strongest. A lot of people misunderstand that. They're like, "Oh, strongest survive." No, it's the most adaptable. Okay, let's see. So Darwin, this is his one illustration in that whole book, Origin of Species. And some things seem really crazy that they would be an adaptation. Sickle cell anemia will kill a person, but it will also keep them alive through malaria. So at least for a while. So you can think of it that sickle cell allows people to live long enough to reproduce and to raise those kids at least to a certain amount. So let's say if people are, in a lot of non-technological societies, people tend to reproduce earlier. So let's say 15 to 20 years old, they have their first kid. By the time that kid is 15 to 20, they're somewhere in their 30s. And a lot of people with sickle cell will die in their late 30s, but they have then perpetuated their genetic line, and they have survived malaria. Excuse me, which kills a lot of people. Okay. So chromosomes, I think you can find enough about this in general. So 23andMe is because you have 23 chromosomes from each side. DNA is the long molecule of those nucleotide pairs. And the DNA makes up the genes. The genes are what controls what actually happens, like your eye color, your hair color, your height. Um, and then there are alleles. These are the variations in those genes. So some things like blue eyes is just one allele, that is recessive. Um, so if there's a brown-eyed gene, that person is going to have brown eyes. That's the dominant gene. Um, um, okay, so but if you're talking about height, I think there's something like 40 alleles that affect a person's height. So, and then there's also environmental factors like, did the person get adequate nutrition? So your genotype is your genetic makeup. Your phenotype is what actually shows up. So did you end up with blue eyes, brown eyes, dark skin, light skin? Are you, do you have big muscles? Like naturally you develop big muscles. What's your phenotype, your physical characteristics? Um, so dominant and recessive, already mentioned with eye color. Heterozygous means there's different alleles, and that will cause something to happen depending on the exact alleles. Homozygous means you have the same ones. For blue eyes, you have to have, and generally these are expressed as capital letters for dominant and lowercase for recessive genes. So for blue eyes, you have to have the homozygous um, alleles from both sides to have blue eyes. Okay, or to have this odd chin formation. But you can express these in a Punnett square, and you can see what the chances are that a person will show up with a particular thing. Let's see. Okay, so, and this applies also with some genetic diseases. PKU is one of them. And that's a really awful disease that'll kill a child very, very young. But more benevolently, you can express, blue eyes or brown eyes this way. Now, range of reaction. So I mentioned that it might take 40 alleles to determine your height. Well, if you get very tall genes, will you be really tall? Maybe, but if you don't get adequate nutrition, you might still be taller than a lot of other people, but it'll be in that range of reaction. You would be on the lower end. If you get great nutrition, then sure, you'll be very, very tall. If you get smaller size genes, maybe if you get great nutrition, you're going to be pretty tall. I always wonder about this, like the what are called pygmies of the Ituri rainforest in Central Africa. Um, you know, they tend to be in the 4 foot tall range. So when you talk about tall, you kind of need to specify a little bit like what kind of tall, because people in Holland are statistically the tallest. Um, and so somebody who's 6'1", 6'2" in Holland, okay, they're all right, but they're not really particularly tall. But that would be a giant if you're talking about Ituri rainforest. Um, okay, so, and then there's correlations. We talked about correlations in chapter 2. Genes and environment work together to create what's actually going to happen. So epigenetics is the term for what happens in the ultimate outcome. What is the phenotype based both on the genetic and the environmental um, um, contributions. Okay, neurons. So this is really important because everything we're going to talk about really in the whole semester all kind of revolves around these structures, which include, neurons as kind of a basis. So your brain is made up of billions of neurons, and they all have a similar structure. They all have a cell body. They all have axons. Maybe it's a very, very short axon, or maybe if it goes from you know your spinal cord all the way down to your little toe, that's the long axon. You know. Okay, so how do these axons, how long are they? Myelin is like the insulation. If you have an electrical wire without insulation, it's going to short out. Um, so they protect and kind of insulate. Babies don't have much myelin. This is one of the reasons that they're emotionally really, flexible. They can go from really happy to screaming their heads off in just a matter of seconds. All right, so wait, there's a couple more things we got to cover here. One is these things, the dendrites, from Greek for tree. This is where the input comes in. So information goes into the dendrite. The cell body says, well, do we have enough information? Do we have enough input to fire? If it does, boop, it goes down to the axon terminals, terminal being an ending, and then something else is going to happen. Neurons do not touch. They communicate with each other by sending out chemical signals. So, this is amazing. So this is a terminal button, and you can see it's like a little, vessel full of these molecules of a neurotransmitter. Okay, pseudo-colored image from a scanning electron microscope. So it's not really this color. They've added the colors to kind of like let you know what's what. But you're going to have neurotransmitters. This would be a neuron up here, and if it gets enough stimulus to fire, it's going to send out these little molecules of love to the next neuron, and then that's going to do something if there's a receptor that receives it. There's an electrical charge. This is one reason that a PET scan works, or you can measure, bottom line, you can measure the electrical charges in neurons if you have sensitive enough equipment, because there's wait, this is a better way to look at this, is this diagram. So resting potential, it's negative. And if you reach this threshold of excitation, if there's enough for it to fire, boop, it's going to go positive. So it's an electrical process that's within the neuron. So between neurons, there are these chemical messages, like in this terminal button, but within the neuron, it's an action potential, which is actually kind of like a electrical engineering term. So depolarization is an odd term that says, well, you're making the neuron less negative, which makes it more likely to fire, because you're waiting for it to get enough stimulus to change its polarity for just a really brief amount of time. So this is microseconds here. Hyperpolarization, there's a more negative charge, which means it's going to take more effort to make it fire. So once it gets enough stimulus to reach the threshold of excitation, boop, it fires. That's the action potential. If it's not firing, it's the resting potential. I'm not very fond of those terms, but that's what they are. Now, there are two terms in a movie or a book. The antagonist is the enemy, right? Well, it's not really an enemy. An antagonist makes it less likely. So it would hyperpolarize, for instance, is one way that an antagonist could work. agonist is going to help a neurotransmitter work. Okay, the other thing though is that for a neurotransmitter to cause a reaction, it's got to find a place to connect in. Um, this diagram is about reuptake, which is a little different, but the idea is that neurotransmitters are a particular shape. So it's like the little shape things that a baby might play in, where it can, it can put the um, square into the square hole, but it can't put the triangle in, for instance. Um, so it's got to be the right shape for that neurotransmitter to work. And then the leftovers that don't find a receptor site on the next neuron, they just keep floating around in that interstitial fluid and they get recycled. It's a lot more efficient to recycle than to do new stuff, right? Okay. So acetylcholine is about your muscle action and also has implications in memory. Endorphins, people will talk about, oh, yeah, I like to jog a long way because I get that endorphin release. Pain and pleasure. Dopamine uh, also feels really good. You get a massive, massive boost of dopamine from methamphetamines, for instance. It affects your mood, your sleep, and your learning. Um, uh, it also has a couple of other effects. Too much dopamine, uh, you may hallucinate. That's a feature of schizophrenia in some people. Too little dopamine, and actually, oddly enough, that's Parkinson's. And you will see old people with Parkinson's who shake all the time. That's from insufficient dopamine. So you'd give them a dopamine supplement, something to increase their dopamine. Epinephrine, generally speaking, if you see epinephrine, it's going to be it's a stimulant, essentially. So heart, intestines, and alertness are affected by that. Serotonin is more about your sleep and your happy kind of mood. Okay, so I guess let's do structure real quick. So central nervous system is, you guessed it, in the center. That's just your brain and your spinal cord, but that includes a whole lot of structures in your brain. And then your peripheral, like peripheral vision, your peripheral nervous system is basically everything else. Okay, so somatic is about your senses and your motor information, and that goes to your sensory motor cortex, which goes kind of across the top of your head. Autonomic nervous system, it's automatic. So the autonomic nervous system controls all the stuff that you don't think about. You don't have to think about digesting your veggie burger. It's going to do that automatically. But that's divided into sympathetic and parasympathetic. So sympathetic is your stress reactions, basically, fight or flight. And while you're doing that, some things are going to be more activated and some things are going to be more shut down. So you're going to have your lungs open up, but you're not going to be digesting that burger. Parasympathetic is when you're off duty. So you can rest, you can digest your burger, you can chill out. And one of the issues that we'll come back to in chapter 15 and 16 is that with modern stresses, current life includes a lot of stresses that are not actually lethal, but our body only knows that reaction. So we're basically, if we're stressed out, we're in a fight or flight response, which is great if you have to get away from a shark or a dinosaur. No, that didn't really happen. But otherwise, you've got essentially, it's like your body is burning too hot and things are going to burn out. Okay, so there's a diagram of how that stuff divides up: central nervous system, peripheral, and then peripheral divides up into somatic, about sensation and movement. Autonomic, you don't have to pay attention to. Sympathetic is fight or flight. Parasympathetic is more like housekeeping. And when you're in the sympathetic, when you have to fight or flee, you're not going to salivate. Your pupils are going to dilate so you can see more. Your lungs are going to open up. Your bronchi are going to dilate. And the bladder is an interesting thing. You don't really want to have to pee if you're trying to swim away from a shark or, you know, avoid a charging mastodon. Uh, so you want to wait for that until you can go into parasympathetic. Okay, so billions of interconnected neurons and glia. The glia are kind of like helper cells. It's bilateral. Um, you know what? Let's go into another PowerPoint for this. Okay, hang on just a moment.